comes out his neighbor's voice, and he's sitting there, not moving, and he says, "Hello, Minnie. I'm Bobby Goldsboro, and I'm really the voice."
Few artists could make you feel the way Bobby Goldsboro did. With his warm Southern charm and gift for storytelling, he became one of the most beloved singer-songwriters of the 1960s and 70s, touching hearts with timeless classics like Honey, Watching Scotty Grow, and See the Funny Little Town. At his peak, Goldsboro was a household name, a regular on international charts, and a familiar face on American television screens. But then his luck changed almost overnight. His marriage fell apart, he faced devastating accusations, and his professional career faded as he was gradually pushed out of the spotlight he once dominated. What really happened to Bobby Goldsboro? How did one of America's brightest stars fade so quickly? And what has he been up to since he'd withdrawn from the public? Join us as we get into all the details. Bobby's early life. Before Bobby Goldsboro became the voice that could move a nation to tears, he was simply Robert Charles Goldsboro, a younger son growing up in a modest rural Southern household. He was born on January 18, 1941, in Marianna, Florida, to Charles Edward and Grace Winnell Goldsboro, who ran a local flower shop. It was a quiet, working-class upbringing, far removed from anything resembling show business. The family relocated to Dothan, Alabama after he finished 9th grade, and it was there that he found his love for music. Music was not his first calling. Bobby once told a reporter that he used to live and breathe baseball, playing both pitcher and second base, dreaming of being drafted by the Cleveland Indians. "But I was too small," he admitted, "and I probably wasn't that good either." So when the diamond stopped being a realistic option, he picked up something else. At 12 years old, he taught himself to play a borrowed ukulele, and before long, he had moved on to guitar. It turned out that Bobby had a natural feel for it that no amount of practice alone could explain. He also tried his hand at other instruments and picked up singing. Bobby found his people at Dothan High School. He joined a band called Spider and the Webs. It consisted of Amos Mugsby on the bass, Dave Robinson on the drums, Flying Fingers, John Rainey on lead guitar, and Rockin', Steve Murphy on rhythm guitar. They started small, playing for local dances and whoever else would have them. The band started playing semi-professionally not long after Goldsboro enrolled in Alabama Polytechnic Institute in 1959 as a business administration major. Bobby made the trip down to Dothan on weekends and vacations to play with the band. By his sophomore year, the band relocated to Auburn, where they won a campus talent show with Goldsboro singing Neil Sedaka's Happy Birthday, Sweet 16. Their growing reputation soon led to bookings from Florida to Missouri, earning the group as much as $100 per musician per performance. That was serious money for a college band at the time, and it was Bobby's first real sign that the band could really be something. Bobby met Mary Alice Watson, a sophomore at Dothan High School, during the spring break that very year. They would end up tying the knot after her graduation on November 11, 1962. Everything changed for the band in the summer of 1961. The band manager, Buddy Bowie, managed to convince Roy Orbison to hire the Webbs as his backup group after he'd grown disenchanted with his former group. They played in Dothan, Panama City, and several cities across Florida. Orbison was so impressed by their performance that he persuaded Goldsboro and the rest of the Webbs to drop out of college and join him on tour for the next 3 years. It was a massive leap of faith for Bobby, but an opportunity like Roy Orbison's did not come around often. During a 2-week tour of England, they headlined alongside the Beatles, responding to crowd pandemonium with 3 or 4 encores every night. Goldsboro amused the other musicians with his imitation of a tree frog, a bit that Paul McCartney himself became fond of recreating. When not on tour, the Webbs recorded Goldsboro-written songs and performed them locally. Jack Gold, an independent producer, eventually took notice of them and offered Goldsboro the song Molly for recording. In 1963, the song made it onto the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Goldsboro left the group not long after, embarking on a solo career that would propel him to the ranks of history's greatest musicians. From Dothan to the top of the world. Bobby Goldsboro's departure from Roy Orbison's band in 1964 was not without risk. He was entering a music industry that was in the midst of a complete transformation. The Beatles had just landed in America, and the British invasion was swallowing up chart space that had once belonged to homegrown artists. For a soft-voiced singer-songwriter from Dothan, Alabama, the timing could not have looked worse on paper. But Goldsboro didn't back down. Producer Jack Gold, who had taken a position as head of A&R at United Artists Records, signed him to a contract that gave him the freedom to write and record his own material. That freedom made a big difference. Orbison left him a better craftsman, and the results were immediate. His first solo single, See the Funny Little Clown, hit number 9 on the U.S. national charts in early 1964, sold over 1 million copies, and was awarded a gold disc, all while the Beatles were dominating everything around it. It was an extraordinary opening address. What came next was a remarkable and consistent series of hits that proved that Goldsboro was the real deal. Over the following years, he racked up several top 40 hits, including favorites like Little Things, Voodoo Woman, and It's Too Late. While Goldsboro wasn't primarily known for soul music, songs like Too Many People and It's Too Late became massive hits on the northern soul scene in Great Britain, receiving a lot of airplay. His influence was wider than many realized, connecting with fans across different music styles and even reaching audiences overseas before his biggest breakthrough had taken place. His live work was just as impressive. The Webbs were there for the final concert of the Beatles' first U.S. tour, hosted by Ed Sullivan at the Paramount Theater in New York, and they also opened for 5 Rolling Stones gigs, one of which was at Carnegie Hall. He then went on to open for the Four Seasons and the Beach Boys, building a reputation on the road that matched everything he was doing in the studio. And while he was at it, Stones guitarist Keith Richards thanked Goldsboro for teaching him a new guitar chord that he would use throughout his career. That was no small accomplishment for a Dothan kid who taught himself to play the ukulele using a borrowed instrument. Between 1960 and 1974, Goldsboro released 44 singles and 20 albums, a pace that would have exhausted most artists. But the biggest moment of his career was still ahead of him, and it arrived in 1968 in a way nobody could have planned. The song, Honey, was not even written by Goldsboro. Bobby Russell, a Nashville songwriter, wrote the song and initially produced it with Bob Shane, a former member of the Kingston Trio. After hearing it and showing interest, Goldsboro invited Russell to perform a few of his songs with producer Bob Montgomery. After listening to Russell's simpler guitar-accompanied rendition, Goldsboro asked if he could record it. Russell agreed on the condition that Goldsboro's version not be released until Shane's had run its course. The recording session took place at Nashville's RCA Studio B, known as the home of 1,000 hits. Producer Montgomery later told Billboard magazine, "We cut it perfectly on the very first take. Everyone looked at each other as if to say, 'Is that it? Did we miss something?' They recorded it a second time just to be certain. It was like the song knew what it wanted to be from the start." After Goldsboro performed it on The Ed Sullivan Show in early February 1968, radio stations began heavily promoting it, and it climbed steadily for 9 weeks before reaching number 1. It sold 1 million copies in its first 3 weeks, becoming United Artists' fastest-selling record ever. It topped the charts for 5 weeks and became the world's best-selling record, selling over 5 million copies and surpassing even the Beatles' Hey Jude. Goldsboro received an award for his efforts in Cannes, France. It was a crossover hit, topping both the pop and country singles charts, one of only 3 songs to do so during the decade, and it received 2 Grammy nominations. Honey turned Bobby into an international star. He had number 1 hits in 23 countries and started to make regular concert tours around the world. In the years that followed, Goldsboro climbed to number 11 on Billboard's national charts with Watching Scotty Grow, written by Mac Davis. Summer the First Time, a 1973 nostalgia tune built around a repeating piano riff, 12-string guitar, and an orchestral string arrangement, became a top 25 hit in the U.S. and reached number 9 in the U.K. But its suggestive subject matter stirred up its share of controversy. His songs were just as resilient. Artists including Aretha Franklin, John Denver, Paul Anka, Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash, Conway Twitty, and Bette Midler recorded his compositions. The Cowboy and the Lady became a top 10 country hit for Brenda Lee in 1980, was covered by Dolly Parton in 1977, and gave John Denver a hit in 1981, while With Pen in Hand peaked at number 3 on the U.S. country chart. 2 of his compositions, With Pen in Hand and Autumn of My Life, were inducted into BMI's exclusive Millionaires Club, which is only for songs that have been played on the air more than 1 million times. By the late 60s, Bobby Goldsboro had achieved something very few artists of his era could claim. He had created a body of work that transcended categorization and forged connections that lasted lifetimes. But his success didn't last forever. The industry had started to shift away from his sincere, soulful style and compositions, and Bobby knew he had to evolve if he wanted to stay on top. Taking on television. After the towering success of Honey, I Autumn of My Life and The Straight Life in 1968, Bobby's music career began to lose steam. He was absent from the charts for over 2 years after those follow-ups, and when he did come back, it was thanks to a chance encounter that had nothing to do with the recording studio. He was shopping for a shirt in a clothing store in Los Angeles when a friend and record producer named Jerry Fuller walked in and mentioned that Mac Davis had written a song he thought might suit Goldsboro. That afternoon, Goldsboro called Davis, who came to the hotel with his guitar, and they spent 4 hours playing songs together. So, had I not been buying a shirt that day, Goldsboro later reflected, I might not have gotten watching Scotty Grow. The song reached number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1971, a welcome comeback that showed his audience had not entirely abandoned him. But American radio was changing rapidly in the early 70s, fragmenting into formats that had little patience for the warm, sentimental balladry that Goldsboro did better than almost anyone. He made his final crack at the Billboard Top 40 in the fall of 1973 with Summer the First Time, which peaked at number 23, while struggling to connect with songs like And I Love You, So Come Back Home, and With Pen in Hand, which barely registered on the charts. The era of Bobby Goldsboro, the pop hitmaker, was drawing to a close, but what came next would prove he was far more than a singer chasing chart positions. Even as his chart fortunes faded, he was already building something more durable behind the scenes. In 1971, he formed House of Gold Music, a Nashville-based publishing company that would go on to become one of the most successful music publishing houses in the city, responsible for such songs as Wind Beneath My Wings and Behind Closed Doors. That was a brilliant move. The man who had lived and died by the Billboard charts was now determined to take his fate into his own hands. And then came television. Thanks to his string of hit records and his natural, quick sense of humor, Goldsboro became a frequent guest on The Tonight Show and The Mike Douglas Show, where audiences connected with him in a way that went far beyond his music alone. He was relaxed, witty, and completely natural on camera, the kind of easygoing charisma that cannot really be taught or manufactured. He even stepped in as a guest co-host on several occasions on The Mike Douglas Show, and it quickly became obvious to viewers that there was far more to him than just sentimental ballads. By 1973, television fully embraced him. The Bobby Goldsboro Show premiered as a nationally syndicated variety series and went on to run for 3 successful seasons, ultimately becoming the highest-rated syndicated variety show of the decade. The program was filmed as an hour-long weekly mix of music and light entertainment, featuring guest performers alongside Goldsboro, who regularly showcased material from his own catalog. Produced at CBS Television City in Los Angeles, the show maintained a clean, family-friendly tone, blending live musical performances with easygoing comedy segments. Interestingly, the comedy became just as popular as the music. Second only to Goldsboro's performances was a recurring sketch featuring a playful, mischievous tree frog named Calvin, who grew so popular with audiences that he eventually inspired his own board game. The idea was not random. The frog character traced back to an impression Goldsboro had developed years earlier while touring with Roy Orbison, a bit that reportedly even made Paul McCartney laugh backstage during a show in England. Even then, unknowingly, Bobby Goldsboro was already shaping what would become a second career. His sharp humor made him a regular fixture on the talk show circuit beyond his own program, and the more he appeared on screen, the more his fame shifted in nature. It was no longer defined purely by record sales or chart positions. Instead, it rested on something far more durable and harder to measure: the genuine affection of an audience that had grown up with his voice and simply enjoyed his presence. By the early 80s, Bobby Goldsboro was at the high point of his professional life, but his personal life had deteriorated greatly. Rumors of infidelity and so much worse were swirling, and they threatened to dismantle everything he'd built. The custody war that almost ended. Bobby Goldsboro's career. In 1982, Bobby Goldsboro filed for a divorce from his wife of 20 years for reasons that remain unexplained till this very day. But the legal battle that followed was so bitter, so relentlessly ugly, that it came close to destroying Bobby. Serious accusations were made that called Bobby's humanity into question, and it would forever change the way people perceived him. Bobby Goldsboro and Mary Alice Watson's relationship began the way every great American love story did, with a chance encounter. They fell fast and married young and started having children almost immediately. Danny was 19 and Terry was 17 by the time of the divorce. Their third child, Brandy, was only 8. The early years of the marriage unfolded against the backdrop of Goldsboro's rise, but somewhere in the late 1970s, the Goldsboro marriage began to come apart at the seams. In the span of 2 years, whatever had once existed between Bobby and Mary Alice Goldsboro had curdled into something genuinely toxic, the kind of divorce where both parties seem determined to ensure that nothing survives intact. Bobby Goldsboro made allegations that Mary Alice Watson would later admit to. Mary had relations with at least 2 men between the ages of 17 and 20 years old, about the ages of her own son. Bobby claimed that parties were held at the Goldsboro home where participants became intoxicated, and on at least one occasion her daughter, Terry, slept in the same bedroom as couples with the apparent approval of her mother. If it were any other case, Bobby should have won the custody dispute for young Brandy there and then, but this was no ordinary case. Terry Goldsboro testified under oath that her father had molested her and a friend when they were both 11 years old. For Bobby Goldsboro, the damage was almost uniquely catastrophic because of who he was. His entire career had been built around emotional innocence and family-centered storytelling. He was the man who sang Honey, the man who recorded songs about fatherhood and domestic tenderness. And now his own daughter was sitting in court describing him as a sexual abuser. The allegations did not stop there. Court records and reporting from the appeals case also referenced testimony regarding a large collection of pornographic material allegedly found in Goldsboro's possession, including material described as involving young girls. Those claims became central to the custody decision and permanently altered public perception of him. Goldsboro denied everything. Publicly and repeatedly, he insisted the accusations were false and that he was being destroyed by a custody battle that had spiraled out of control. In one of his most widely quoted statements, he said, "The worst thing that could be said about someone with my image, who sings about family life and children, is child molesting. It's almost like you're helpless when something like this happens." He was never arrested. He was never criminally charged. No criminal prosecution was ever brought against him. The allegations existed entirely within the framework of the divorce and custody proceedings, a distinction that would become critically important in later years as people tried to separate accusation from legal fact. But family court operates differently than criminal court, and the judge still had to decide where custody would go. The outcome proved deeply controversial. The Tennessee Court of Appeals acknowledged that the evidence presented against Mary Alice Watson was serious and troubling. Yet, despite that, the court upheld the decision against Goldsboro, concluding that there was sufficient evidence to determine he was not a suitable custodial parent for the couple's youngest daughter, Brandy. Circuit Court Judge Henry Bell granted Goldsboro the divorce itself, but awarded custody of Brandy to Mary Alice. Goldsboro's legal team announced plans to continue appealing the decision, but by then, the practical damage had already spread far beyond the courtroom. Newspapers across the country had picked up the story. The accusations were now attached permanently to his name. Financially, the divorce was also devastating. Reports from the period stated that Goldsboro was left with only 1/3 of the couple's estimated $3 million estate. For a man whose career momentum had already slowed during the changing musical climate of the late 1970s, the collapse of his marriage came at the worst possible time. And perhaps most hauntingly, the case never ended with a clean sense of resolution. The trial judge reportedly declined to fully accept either side's version of events in totality, leaving the truth trapped in a murky middle ground that neither fully cleared nor fully condemned Bobby Goldsboro. But public opinion rarely operates with that kind of nuance. For many people, the allegations alone were enough. And while he was never officially barred from the entertainment industry, the years that followed made one thing abundantly clear. Bobby Goldsboro's time in the limelight was over, but he didn't let that stop him from chasing new dreams and opportunities. The disappearance and reinvention of Bobby Goldsboro. In the years immediately following the divorce, Bobby Goldsboro did something few people expected from a man who had spent most of his adult life in front of cameras, microphones, and sold-out audiences. He disappeared, not entirely, not dramatically, but enough that people began to notice the silence. By the mid-1980s, Goldsboro had stepped away from live performance altogether, retreating from the spotlight that had once defined him. Even without criminal charges or a conviction, the scandal of the custody battle changed the way many people looked at him, and Goldsboro seemed to understand that instinctively. Rather than fighting to remain constantly visible, he quietly stepped back. But what makes this period so fascinating is that it was not simply a retreat, it was a reinvention. In 1983, just as the legal fallout from the divorce was beginning to settle, Goldsboro met a woman named Diane. According to him, the connection was immediate. It was love at first sight, he later said. We were married a year later, and we've not spent one night apart. I don't go anywhere without her. The two married on April 11, 1985, and by all accounts, Diane became the stabilizing force in Goldsboro's life during a period when much else had collapsed. More than simply his wife, she became his creative partner, collaborator, and emotional anchor during the next phase of his career. Long after the recording industry moved on from his style of music, Diane remained beside him as he built something entirely new. That new direction surprised almost everyone. Long before television became his second act, Goldsboro had shown interest in family entertainment. As early as 1969, during his success as a recording artist, he wrote a children's book and project titled Snuffy the Elf Who Saved Christmas. At the time, it seemed like a side project, but in hindsight, it was an early blueprint for his later career. Through the late 70s and early 80s, he continued developing children's concepts. Once he stepped away from touring and mainstream recording, he committed fully. In 1991, that gamble paid off when his animated Easter special, Easter Egg Mornin', premiered on the Disney Channel. Goldsboro wrote the music and voiced the lead character, Picasso Speedy Cottontail. The soundtrack reportedly went gold within 3 weeks, and the special remained on the Disney Channel for 11 consecutive years, becoming its longest-running Easter program. For Goldsboro, the success meant more than ratings. After years rebuilding his life and reputation, Easter Egg Mornin' showed audiences were still willing to embrace him in a new form. He did not stop there. In 1993, actor Burt Reynolds, a longtime friend, convinced him to become musical director for the CBS comedy Evening Shade. Goldsboro composed music weekly, wrote and performed the theme song, and earned a BMI award for his work, the first the series had received. His most ambitious project arrived in the mid-1990s with the Swamp Critters of Lost Lagoon. Unlike typical celebrity ventures, this was built entirely from the ground up and financed personally, as he refused outside investors to avoid creative interference. As he explained, the minute somebody puts in money, they think they have the right to say, "Why don't you make that alligator purple instead of green?" The Swamp Critters of Lost Lagoon became a 52-episode live-action children's series centered on anthropomorphic swamp animals. Goldsboro wrote every script, composed every song, played every instrument, voiced every major character, and oversaw nearly every aspect of production. The costume heads alone reportedly contained over $20,000 in animatronic technology for facial movement and eye control. Each episode featured original songs across country, blues, Cajun, jazz, classical, and rock. Goldsboro insisted children deserved sophisticated entertainment. "I've never understood talking down to kids and treating them like they're imbeciles," he said. The show launched in 1996 on PBS and other networks and became successful enough to inspire live performances at theme parks and major fairs across the South. In today's media climate, Bobby Goldsboro would almost certainly never have been given a third chance. Modern platforms preserve allegations, court records, and controversy indefinitely, making reinvention difficult. But his second act unfolded in a pre-internet era when public memory was shorter and scandals faded more quickly. Because he never faced criminal charges and continued creating successful projects, he managed to rebuild a creative career. By 1999, that second act received official recognition when he was inducted into the Alabama Music Hall of Fame, honoring a career defined by reinvention and persistence. By the 2000s, Bobby Goldsboro had made his peace with life outside the spotlight. On the day he turned 65, he bought a camera, brushes, and a set of oil paints, and taught himself to paint from scratch. There was no teacher and no formal training, just a man with time on his hands and everything still to say. The first 4 paintings he listed on his website sold within 48 hours. From there, he built a second identity as a visual artist. His work was exhibited in galleries across the United States, and he frequently donated pieces to charity auctions and fundraising events. One commissioned painting reportedly sold for $25,000, with proceeds going to an organization providing service dogs for veterans who have lost limbs in combat. His children's work also continued to have a long afterlife. The Swamp Critters of Lost Lagoon remained in circulation well beyond its original run, airing on networks such as TCT Kids and Smile of a Child, introducing new audiences to work created decades earlier by a man they knew only as a storyteller. At 85, it remains a mystery what new creative project the songwriter, storyteller, and painter will take on next, but it is certain to be something exciting. What is your favorite Bobby Goldsboro song or TV show? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click on the next video shown on your screen.